about a few Okay, then I'll talk about a few applications there. So once again, for the agenda, I'll start with the introduction to LiDAR point clouds. I believe you have some more sessions tomorrow as well on LiDAR point clouds, so it'll be a good thing to have a holistic view. And then after that, we'll talk about spatial analysis, and I will focus mostly on locality because that is that's a conventionally used criterion for spatial analysis in point clouds. And then we move on to using the locality for constructing local geometric descriptors, and then we will do eigenvalue based analysis of that. So if you ask me what the scientific computing part is, really all of it belongs to scientific computing on in a more rightful way, and everything else is on top of it, right? So yeah, so with respect to, I just want to as before we start, I just want to say that I won't be talking about machine learning. While machine learning is a very important component in point cloud processing, in this particular talk I don't have any material. That said, I can speak a few minutes on that. That should be okay. Okay. So just to motivate, we have LiDAR technology now, because you have been already introduced to several kinds of remote sensing technologies and geospatial observation technologies. LiDAR is just one more of that those that fall in that category, right? So we have LiDAR, which is essentially light detection and ranging. Uh, if you would expand it. And it is an active remote sensing technology that is used for sensing height, and that gives you information about topography. Okay? And what we essentially have is there are a few methodologies in which the measurements can be taken. And so when we say it's light detection, it essentially means it is a laser scanning technology. And we have these few methodologies which are typically used for laser scanning. Airborne LiDAR is one, and terrestrial LiDAR is the other one. In airborne LiDAR, until a few years ago or a decade ago, usually it was done by low flying airplanes. And increasingly, drones are taking over that part because of the hassle of having to fly a airplane, and drones are a little more efficient and in that sense, right? And then there are terrestrial LiDAR, where the idea is there are either static or moving platforms which will allow you to capture the same scans of buildings and so on. And of that, vehicle LiDAR has become quite popular these days with the requirement of autonomous vehicle driving. And in that regard, the mobile vehicle LiDAR is also another type of LiDAR that we can get data from. Okay. So I will talk a little bit about how the data is captured and then move on to the processing of the data. Uh, to say, I am not an expert really in the LiDAR measurement technology. I don't know as much about the sensors and so on and so forth. I work mostly in the part where once the data is available, how do you work with the data? And that's essentially where the computational part comes in. For the light detection and ranging, that is the LiDAR technology, it is most times or all times we would end up getting something called point clouds. And point clouds are essentially a set of three-dimensional points. It gives X, Y, Z locations. And some of it has to be corrected based on the GPS location of the sensor and things like that, right? This is very different from what you would have probably been introduced to, which is the imagery data, which can be ortho images, aerial photography, satellite imagery, and so on and so forth. The pertinent difference between the two is the imagery data gives two-dimensional view, so that's somewhat limited by that. and the point cloud gives you three-dimensional data. Now that said, both of them have their pros and cons. I'm not here to debate if imagery is better or point cloud is better. They both give information amply, and there are enough methods to work with that kind of data sets. And largely, most of the work has shown that if you look at both the data sets together, you can make more meaningful understanding of the data, right? Of the scenery that has been scanned or that has been measured in that sense, right? So imagery gives you a single view, and of course, if you have multiple views, you can generate a lot more understanding of the scene. Point cloud, on the other hand, gives you geometric data, and you can again you can extract enough information from that. The idea is to understand how much information you can extract from any of these data sets, so that you can combine them together and use them in meaningful fashion, right? So if I look at this image on the right, this shows how essentially airborne LiDAR works. So the laser scanner emits light rays, laser beams, and it hits objects on its path, and it returns, right? And the energy with which it returns will tell us important information about, number one, the height at which it returned back from, and number two, the material of the material property of the object that it has intersected with. So these are the mainly two information that we really need, and it brings back that information. Now, again, LiDAR, because it is light based, it has issues with respect to climatic conditions. If it's a cloudy sky, you will not be able to get good results, and so on and so forth. But again, there are ways around this, right? There are corrections we can do to enable to get good data, right? Now, the mobile LiDAR or the vehicle LiDAR operates slightly differently. I just put these two to give to show the drastic difference between the way data is collected. In this particular one, the idea is there is a sensor that rotates in 360 degrees, and it captures information around, right? So the kind of sampling you get when you see vehicle LiDAR data and when you see airborne LiDAR or terrestrial LiDAR, it's very different, right? So that's mainly to do with the way in which the sensor is placed, the sensor moves, and the sensor collects the data. Okay. Now, these are examples of how LiDAR data sets themselves look like. So, this is an example of aerial LiDAR. This DAILS data set, which is collected by University of Dayton in Ohio. And this was released in 2020. It's a very recent, quite large annotated data set. And it has around 5.5 billion points in this one. This is the Oakland data, and this is sorry, it's not mobile data, it's actually terrestrial LiDAR data. And this is also one of the very widely studied, publicly available data set, just like Dale's is. And this is semantic kitty data, which is the data set for autonomous driving. And this is again annotated data set of several trajectories. I believe it's around 13 or 14 trajectories with several time frames of the LiDAR point cloud data that has been collected. So these are again publicly available data sets, very large data sets, and quite clean, right? As in, they have been curated very well, so they can be used widely. This is one another data set that I have used, or in our lab we have used quite a bit, which is the Vihinkin benchmark data set, which was published by ISPRS, which is the International Society for Remote Sensing. Now, so going back to the other part of what the title of the talk is about scientific computing. Now, scientific computing just means that it you we end up using all mathematical modeling, numerical analysis, and computer systems. Typically, scientific computing is tied to working with differential equations, and so hence most of the scientific computing work they sort of hover around scientific and mathematical data, scientific mathematical engineering data sets, right? Briefly, Golub and Ortega, they are stalwarts in the scientific computing domain itself. It is a So they have said that this is a collection of tools, techniques, and theories required to solve on a computer mathematical models of problems in science and engineering. And scientific computing is also to be understood as the bedrock of high performance computing and things like that, which was quite widely used for before the big data technologies and the machine learning and deep learning and all of that became quite in vogue, right? So scientific computing has been around for several decades now, and it's a very well established area of study. Now, scientific computing is important for LiDAR point clouds mainly because of two things. One is because it captures geometric information, so it more or less falls in the area of science and engineering, and not more or less, it falls in the area of science and engineering. And the other part is the data that's collected is in very high volume. So typically, most point cloud data sets that are at least curated and published, they are around million to billion point clouds, billion points in a single data set. So to work with these kind of data sets, we need to understand numerical methods which are efficient, right? So with that, I move on to the next thing, which is the spatial analysis using locality. Now, as I mentioned earlier as well, the point clouds capture this XYZ location of each point that the laser beam has encountered on its path, right? Uh, as in it collided with an object, and it captured that information and returned, really, right? So that's essentially the data that we have. Now, there are multiple ways of working with this data, but if we look closely at how computational geometry and computer graphics, where these kind of positional information is very widely used, we can see that a lot of the methods are around using local methods. As in, the idea is you capture all the information that is possible from the point of view of each point in the data set, right? So in that regard, we capture this the information around it and then use it in a meaningful fashion, right? So there are different kinds of locality which are used typically in most scientific computing problems, and they are largely to do with spatial locality and temporal locality. Now, spatial locality and temporal locality more or less works the same way. If you look at space, three-dimensional space, and time as a physical dimension, they all work the same. But there are some differences in the way in which some of the processing is done if it is time series versus if it's just spatial data. Then we also get to see spatio-temporal locality, which is a hybrid thing, where the idea is the data itself entails four physical dimensions. So um, uh, we want to be able to work with the data in that with that semantics, right? With the understanding that the data itself has space as well as time information in it. Now, yeah, so the one thing that we also have to understand is most of these data sets are samples of um, data, which is samples of phenomena which are continuous in nature. Like, for example, if you look at the height field, it is meant to be a continuous field. Um, of course, there are points of discontinuities in many of these things, but the idea is, in reality, these are not, you don't really see samples like how you would see in population, right? So there's a vast difference between how these fields are versus if you look at height weight of people in a population, that sort of thing, right? So in that regard, most of these data sets are continuous in nature, and the data that we have are essentially samples of this continuous field. So the quality of the data also depends on the sampling of the a sampling that has been used to collect the information and collect the data itself. Okay, so the idea is then to use locality to get back this continuity that we have lost as a part of sampling, right? And when we talk of sampling, obviously we know the Nyquist theorem, and if we don't have enough number of samples, we are unable to reconstruct the data itself. So all of those kick in. But the idea here is, given that we have good samples, we assume that we have good samples. In such a scenario, how would we try to reconstruct the actual scenario, right? The actual scene or the region that we have taken observations from. So in that regard, we use locality. Now, locality just means that we are capturing information of things around the entity that we are talking about, the point that we are talking about. And this information is now sort of stored in something called the descriptor, right? So descriptor, you can think of it as just like another data structure or a placeholder where you're going to store the information about the locality of a particular entity. Okay? Now, so now the next question is, if we are going to take information from, a locality, obviously we have neighbors, right? So locality is made of neighbors, just like for any person, their locality is made of their office neighbors or house neighbors or, community neighbors and things like that, right? So in the same way, in points also there are neighbors, which are again other points, right? Now, before we try to understand how the locality influences a particular point, we need to identify which of the other points are the ones we would call them as the neighbors of the point that we are interested in. Now, there are several ways of doing it, right? So what I will do now is I'll call this particular operation that we are going to do as a search operation. So we are going to find which are the local neighbors. Now, so for that we have to identify a local neighborhood search volume. So we say that this is the criterion by which we are going to identify somebody as some point as a neighbor of a concern point. Now, for that regard, we will say that this criterion is tied to saying that this is the shape of the search volume that I'm going to look for, or a certain criterion by which I'm going to look for, and that will help me identify the local neighbors. Now, there are a few methodologies which are conventionally used. So the very popularly used one is the k nearest neighborhood. Just like you see KNN in machine learning and in say clustering and all of that, we essentially do the same thing here. So we identify an integer k, a positive integer k, and we would try to find that many number of neighbors by virtue of the distance from the particular point that we are talking about. So k can be 1, k can be 2, k can be 10 thousands, whichever, right? So it can vary. Now, so this is based on what the k value is. Now, the next one is called the R neighborhood, where we use this value R to define the sphere around which we are going to find neighbors. So that will give us the spherical neighborhood. So for finding these neighbors, now we are beginning to use Euclidean distance, right? So we use Euclidean distance or L2 norm to find the neighbors that we want to find. And the next one is we can use cylindrical neighborhood. Again, in cylindrical neighborhood, you would think that the radius of the cylinder as well as its height would be its parameters. But here we can disregard the height because we can think of the cylinder spanning through the entire height of the entire data set. Uh, so these are again, so here again the parameter is just R. And another one that we have in my lab, we have explored, and I've seen some evidences, some literature on the kind of neighborhood that has been used is something of cubical neighborhood, right? So here the idea is instead of having to use Euclidean distance to finding the neighbor, I can just use the max norm distance or the Chebyshev distance, and then I can find the neighborhood. So here I'm just saying in X or Y or Z direction, if I have a point which is within a value L, I would take it as my neighbor. Now, I can also say that the cubical neighborhood is an approximation of the spherical neighborhood, because I can say that the edge length of the cube can be twice the radius here, and it contains the sphere, so it's approximating the spherical neighborhood. So these are the kinds of neighborhood search that I'm going to do. So this is to do with the search. Now obviously to implement the search, I need spatial data structures to make it efficient. So I will need KD trees or OC trees or so on and so on and forth to make sure that my search is going to be efficient. So if I say I want K nearest neighbor, I can do it as quickly as I want to, or I can take a lot of time. But the goal of many of these systems that we are talking about, the computing systems that we are talking about, is it has to be efficient enough, right? So to make the search efficient, we obviously need data structures that we have talked about in, say, computer science. So we need spatial data structures to help us with performing, to implementing that. Now, just to shift a little bit, we also see gridded data, especially when we voxelize the point cloud that we have. So instead of looking at it as point by point, we could also divide it into several volumetric cells. So because of that, we call it voxels, and then we can analyze the data. So these look like, some bricks put together. So those are essentially voxels. Now, the good part of voxelizing a volume like this, volume or the space where we have all these points, is we can then follow some kind of indexing system. I can say ijk, and then move from ijk to I plus 1 jk, and so on and so forth. Like just like you would walk from, in pixels in an image, in the same fashion you could do that. So there are two kinds of neighborhoods that we can use here as well. That is the von Neumann neighborhood, where it just takes the neighbors along the principal axis like X, Y, and Z. Or there is the Moore neighborhood, where we also consider the diagonal elements as well, right? So these are the two different kinds of neighborhoods we would look for in lattice formatted data. Now we move on to we have decided that we will take a point at a time, and then we'll find neighbors. So we have now found neighbors, right? Now what do we do with these neighbors? That is something that we have to figure out. So here what we are going to do is we will say that so suppose I find the neighbors, the me and my neighbors, we form some kind of a structure, right? It's a physical structure. I give it some shape. Now this shape will tell me what kind of shape it will show up in the in the structure itself eventually, right? In the space itself eventually. Now to understand what kind of structures or features that we are talking about, uh, we need to understand the geometry, right? So these are all geometric features.
Hello, Dr. Venkateswarrao. Kindly, Vishweswarrao, kindly mute yourself.
Hello. Hello, Dr. Visheshwaraya, sir.
Dr. Jaya, kindly unmute yourself. Hello. Professor Jaya, kindly unmute yourself. I muted all, so that was the problem.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. That's okay. That's good. Yeah, so we were talking about geometric features. So we are saying that these points belong to these geometric features when we look at them in terms of the point clouds, right? Now, so what are the geometric features we are looking for, right? So there are largely three types of features. So if you look at three-dimensional data, there are three types of features. If you look at two-dimensional data, there are two types of features, right? So depending on the dimensionality of the data, you will have that many types of features. So in point clouds, if you look at three-dimensional point clouds, we have edge type features, surface type features, and we have junction type features. Now, the idea here is the point along with its neighbor, when it sits in these features, it will assume shapes, right? So now what we are trying to do is we have used this neighborhood search volume to identify who the local neighbors of a particular point is. And now we will try to find the shape of that neighborhood, and that shape will tell us will it belong to an edge type feature or a point type feature or a surface type feature. So just to indicate what I mean by edge, point, and surface type, so we can look at this solid geometry example. So here you see the edge is essentially a sharp edge, just like you would see on rooftops, the gabled roofs, those are the sharp edges. And junctions are points where two edges meet. That's essentially junction. And then you have surface type features, which are essentially uh, uh, points lying on a surface. I would also mention here that not all the points in the point cloud you get from LiDAR technology will tend to fall in one of these three. There will be points like points on foliage, for instance, in vegetation, where you can't identify what the geometric structure is. So typically those kinds of points will also fall under junction points, because either the thing with the junction point is one is unable to figure out what its neighborhood is like, right? So all those points, including the junction points, then fall into one category. Okay. So this is essentially what we are trying to do now. So we have a point we have identified as local neighborhood, and from the local neighborhood, once we find the shape of the local neighborhood, we will be able to extract the descriptors, right? So that will describe the local neighborhood. So that's essentially that I just spoke about. The shape of the local neighborhood is what we are now looking for. So we started out with point cloud. We looked at each point. From each point, we decided we will identify its neighbors. And once we identify the neighbors, now we will look for local neighborhood. So that's essentially how this is going. Okay. Now, so the next thing we will talk about is local geometric descriptors. Now, local geometric descriptors for the larger sense, we just need to look at it as a place where we are going to store the information about the neighborhood, right? So all the points in the neighborhood is going to keep some information about themselves in that particular um, uh, descriptor, right? So that's essentially the idea. So that opens up the question as to how we are going to store these descriptors, right? So then we will come back and say that, okay, I will look at them as, say, for example, I can look at them as anything for that matter, right? But for the purpose of what we want to do after we identify this descriptor, or the way in which we use the descriptor, for now we will say that we will use them in the form of second order tensor fields. Okay? Now, so that prompts me to tell you more about what tensors are. Now, these tensors that we are talking about are different from the data tensors you would have heard when you look at TensorFlow and all of those things. These tensors are essentially physical tensors that we encounter in science and engineering. Now, physical tensors just mean that these are again some kind of data structures which store information, And this is considered to be the superset of all the quantities that you end up measuring, all the physical quantities you end up measuring, be it temperature, pressure, height, anything, right? Velocity, gradients of velocity, stress, strain, all of that, everything falls under tensors essentially. Okay. Now, there are various definitions you would find about what a tensor is. You can think of them as function maps mathematically. It can be tensor products, like for example, outer product, and so on and so forth. So you can see a whole range of explanations on what definitions on what tensors themselves are. Okay. So we look at some of the familiar ones. So when we talk of tensors, as I mentioned, we are storing information, right? And now we have pieces of information. So how many pieces or components of information will we have? So that's given by the dimension, power, order. So the dimension and order are characteristics of each tensor. Now, if it is a zeroth order tensor, that means the order is always, this number is always going to be 1. Anything power 0 is 1. So it will always have only one component. And that describes something called scalar fields that we see for, say, temperature or height field. All of that come under scalar fields. So these are, we are talking about continuous fields. The scalar, vector, tensor fields are continuous fields. And zeroth order tensor essentially means there is one value for each entity, right? Entity means point or grid or whatever it is. It is going to be just one value. Now, vector is essentially where you, it's called a first order tensor. The idea here is you have a D component vector for D-dimensional space. So, for example, for velocity, positional information, all of those become vectors and they are first order tensors. Yeah. Now, the second order tensors are again, it adds more complexity. So, we have D-dimensional second order tensors would be a D cross D square matrix, right? So, these are the variations. Then third order tensor would be T cross D, and it will just go on, right? Now, the idea here is to also say that uh, the second order tensors that we are interested in are represented using matrices, right? And there is a representation theory in mathematics which governs it, by which they say that second order tensor can be represented in the form of matrices. Now, matrix representation is used for several things. Like, for example, if you look at transformations, they are also represented in the form of matrices. But here we are linear transformation, sorry. They are represented in the form of matrices. But here we are saying that we are looking at only the second order tensors which are represented in the form of matrices. Okay. Now, so there are a few things here. So dimensionality refers to the same physical dimensionality we talked about when it comes to spatial dimensions, spatio-temporal dimensions. It's the same thing here. The order or degree or rank will tell us what kind of tensor it is. It's going to be scalar, vector, second order tensor. And typically the order is also, it also tells us where the tensor came from, as in what generated this particular tensor. Say, for example, the sum of orders of tensor that is used in a tensor product will give us a higher order tensor. So if we look at a second order tensor, we can say that it has been created by two first order tensors, right? Which is true, because if you take an outer product of a vector, right? Outer product is like V into V transpose, we get a tensor, and that's essentially a second order tensor, right? Now, these are, as I mentioned already, it's represented using matrices and so on and so forth, right? So then we come to something that because they are matrices, now we can do eigenvalue decomposition, right? So when we do eigenvalue decomposition, obviously we'll get vectors and eigenvectors, and we'll get eigenvalues. So if the matrix size is D, we get D eigenvectors and we get D eigenvalues. If we put the eigenvectors together, we will get this orthonormal matrix, right? This orthonormal matrix just means that the inverse is equal to the transpose, and the columns of V are essentially the eigenvectors of this matrix T, right? So this is not really pertaining to second order tensors, it's pertaining to matrices. So for both, we can now do this eigenvalue decomposition. Now it's quite neat that we have a square matrix and we can do eigenvalue decomposition and things like that now, right? Now this eigenvalue matrix itself is a diagonal matrix, right? So its diagonal values will give us the eigenvalues, right? So we need all of this to say that from a tensor we will get these eigenvalues and eigenvectors, right? So from the tensor or the matrix, we will get these eigenvalues and eigenvectors. And we can then also look at it from the other point of view. We can use that to reconstruct the tensor. Now, this is essentially what we do here. So we take the outer product of each of the eigenvector and its transpose, and then multiply it by the corresponding eigenvalue and sum it all up for the d eigenvalues. We get this tensor back, right? And this is essentially what we do for principal component analysis. We say that these eigenvectors, which are very prominent, we'll keep them because their eigenvalue is significant enough. If they're not significant, we'll just reduce them to 0, and that's how we pick certain dimensions when we do principal component analysis. So you can see that all of these are really tied together. The methodologies are fairly similar here. Okay. Now, so we said we are looking at this local neighborhood in the form of second order tensors, right? Now, in second order tensors too, we are interested in only this specific thing, which is called the positive semi-definite second order tensors. Now, the positive semi-definite second order tensors has this neat property that the eigenvalues will all be positive, right? So when we say that, sorry, they are non-negative, they are 0 or positive, right? So what that means is that the eigenvalues we get are not going to, we'll have some kind of nice ordering in them, and they will exist for sure. It's not going to be that the eigenvalues will not exist. They will be real values. So we can then utilize once we figure out this eigenvalue decomposition. So that's what happens when we say that. This goes back to saying that the local geometric descriptor can be said to be a positive semi-definite tensor. Then we can do this thing where we can say that its eigenvalue is going to exist and they will be non-negative, and we can use them, right? So if it's negative, then it causes other problems. For now, we will say that because they're all positive and there is no sign difference between the eigenvalues, we can use them in a comfortable way, right? So that is why we need this representation to be set correctly when we started off, right? So that's essentially the thing with saying that we look at them as second order tensor fields. Now, these local geometric descriptors that we said are going to describe the geometry of the local neighborhood are, now we can define them properly, right? We can say that they are mathematical quantities which are used for finding the shape of the local neighborhood, and they're computed as positive semi-definite second order tensors, right? Now, the commonly used one is the covariance matrix or the covariance tensor, which is typically used for 3D point clouds, for 3D meshes, and so on and so forth. And these are essentially tensor product or the outer product. So outer product is different from the inner product. In an inner product is essentially the dot product. You would do V transpose V and you get a single value. But when we do outer product, we expand the tensor, we expand the vector, right? So we do V into V transpose and we get uh, a d-dimensional matrix there, right? Now, yeah, so here when we have covariance tensor or matrix, whichever you want to call it, they typically are tensor product of distance or tangent vectors, right? Tangent just means that when you have a surface, there's a tangent to it, because we are talking about geometry here, right? There's a surface and there's a tangent. And that tangent, if you take that vector and do outer product of it, you would get the covariance tensor. Now, there is another methodology that we have tried from our lab, which is using the tensor voting. Tensor voting is a methodology used in computer vision to find geometry and organize points in a perceptual fashion, which follows something called Gestalt's principles for perceptually organizing things. So that's the way we see and we put things together, right? So in tensor voting, it essentially follows similar rules. I'll show you how tensor voting briefly works. Now, the tensor voting thing, the interesting part is, even though the covariance tensor is a outer product of tangent tensors, tangent vectors, the tensor voting is an outer product of normal vectors. Okay, so what that means is when you have a surface, there is a normal and then there's a tangent, right? So the tangent is what gets captured in the covariance tensor, and the normal is what gets captured in the tensor voting thing, right? And this works with you aggregate votes from the neighbors. So each neighbor would vote, right? Vote saying that this is the information I want to give you, and these votes get collected, and that's essentially what tensor voting field is all about. Right? Recently, in 2016, they figured out a closed form solution for tensor voting, which is actually pretty neat. Earlier, before this, it was somewhat harder to compute tensor voting because it had to happen in an iterative fashion. When I say iterative fashion, it means that the neighbors will give me information, but the information about the neighbors itself has to be updated, right? So it gets updated and then it updates the point and it goes back and forth, right? So that's essentially the iterative process. But the closed form solution gives you a neat formula that you can use and compute the tensor itself. Okay? So the sum total of it is the local geometric descriptor of a point is now computed as the sum of the semi-definite, positive semi-definite second order tensors that you compute for each point. For each neighbor, you can find a contribution in the form of a tensor, and these contributions are all added up in the local geometric descriptor. Okay? Now, going forward, what covariance is essentially computed with respect to the centroid or mean, right? There's a lot of study in computer vision where they have looked at what it means if you take it with respect to the mean versus the point itself. So there are a lot of methodologies which use either one. So we'll simplify it for now. We will say that the tangent vector or the distance vector that we are looking at is going to just take it with respect to the point. So y is the neighbor and x is the point we are finding the tensor at. So we say y minus x and then we do the outer product. It can be a weighted outer product. We'll figure out what the weight is, right? And then we can add it all up. This becomes a three-dimensional covariance matrix. Now, if you look at it from a statistics point of view, essentially what you are trying to do here is we take the x value of all the neighbors and find the variance in the x values. That is essentially how we compute the diagonal. It's the variance in that same dimension, right? In the x direction or the y direction or the z direction. And in the other parts of the matrix, we are essentially finding the covariance between x and y values. So that's essentially what the covariance matrix is. So what this reduces to is essentially this, right? And so the other thing we need to understand is what we use here is actually used in other places in a lot of different ways. So if you read the literature too, it will be referred to in different ways. So for example, there will be literature which says that in point cloud analysis, point cloud processing, this is computed as principal component analysis. And it's also the same thing. I mean, we're doing the same thing again and again, right? Now, so this is how the local neighborhood shapes look like now, right? So if you have one where there is one, the major eigenvalue is very high compared to the other eigenvalues, you will get this stretched out feature. So that gives you a neighborhood which is shaped like a cylinder, right? And it is like this long, thin, string-like thing, right? Because only the major eigenvalue matters there, right? And it will say that the neighborhood is going in a certain direction. Now that also says that that point must lie on an edge in the geometric features, right? Now, the next one is where the first two eigenvector, the eigenvalues, lambda 0 and lambda 1, are quite comparable. and the last eigenvalue is very small, right? So then it means that it will look like a plate. Now that gives a surface type feature. It falls in a surface type feature. And the last one is all the eigenvalues are comparable, right? So then it becomes a volumetric feature, or which is called a junction feature, right? And this just says that it's isotropic in all the directions, right? Now, when we go to tensor voting, we see similar kind of concepts there, right? So, but what this is saying is each vector that each vote that each neighbor is going to give is going to be a combination of these things called stick tensor, plate tensor, and ball tensor. We can disregard all of this for now, but you can get the drift, right? This is behaving like the geometric features themselves, right? So what the computer vision and the tensor voting concept says is also when you have a stick tensor, the influence of your neighbors varies. The function that you say that the weight that you would give for the neighbors that you have is in this format. So it uses this dumbbell field, dumbbell shaped field, and it says that the neighbors which are very close are going to influence that point a lot, much lesser compared, much more compared to the points which are further away. And the points in these places are not going to influence that particular point at all. If it is a ball tensor, it just means that the closer they influence a lot, as they go further away, they don't influence as much, right? For point clouds, we typically, because we don't have the orientation information, we typically treat them as unoriented points, and then we compute the ball tensor, and then we iterate and improve on this to find all the other components. That's essentially how the tensor voting works for point clouds. Now, this is a closed form solution, which is actually pretty neat. So this says that you can use the normal vectors, normal tensors, compute them, and use them here. But you could also you can seed your tensor voting with a second order tensor that you have already computed for that point. So what that means is now you can actually put in the covariance tensor here, right? That will work, right? So what you are saying is you can use a covariance tensor and also find the information of the neighbors if you were to incorporate tensor vote, right? So this is essentially how that works. And then you aggregate all the votes, right? So you add up all the votes that each of the neighbors are giving. So that's what ij is, and you do it for all the dimensions. So that's essentially how tensor voting works. Now we move on to something called scale spaces. The idea of scale spaces is now whatever we are saying is actually dependent on what we had decided as a neighborhood volume is, right? The neighbor search volume decided who is going to get allocated as my neighbor. Now this can be any, the search volume can have any size. Now there's nothing saying that sacred about a particular size for a particular search. Now, what we will go in and say is, so we will use the scale space theorem that is used in image processing and in physics as well. What it says is the scale, as in the scope of what you're going to look for, is going to decide what information you're going to gather. That is commonsensical, right? So if I say I'm going to look at only the people in my floor, I will find only them as my neighbors. But if I take, the neighbors from my floor and the next floor, because of COVID-19, obviously the +1 and -1 floors are also affected, then they all become my next level of neighborhood. And if I go one more level, everybody in my flat is really my neighbor, right? And if I go one more level, everybody in my street is my neighbor, right? So it just keeps growing. So that decides the scale, right? Now the idea is in point clouds, because they are environmental data sets and there's a lot of uncertainty in the data, we cannot typically fix what my neighborhood search is going to be. So I will try it for different scale values, and then I will pick whichever is the best one, or I'll figure out a way in which I can use all the scales that I have already computed for, right? So that's essentially what we'll do now. So we will compute the local geometric descriptor for different scales, right? and we will decide which to keep and how we are keeping them. Either we find the best optimal scale, or we will what we will do is we will aggregate all these scales in another fashion. We'll just add up the values that we compute, or we can just put them as is, like create a long feature vector which can be used for machine learning algorithms and things like that, right? So that's the there are different ways in which you can then use these scales, right? Now, so we talked a lot about local geometric descriptors. Now, how can we use them? So we can use them in several ways. They are very regularly used as feature vectors and semantic classification. When I say semantic classification, what I mean is when we collect these point clouds, we don't really know what object it came back from, even though it has encoded that information. That's most times you can't use clustering or something and then find out which material it came from. Did it come from a tree or a building or road, because there is ambiguity in the data, right? And of course there is noise in the data and several other things, right? So there are a lot of uncertainties by which semantic classification of point clouds is not a straightforward problem. So we need to find appropriate feature vector for doing the supervised learning, right? Or unsupervised learning, whichever it is, right? And the other part is nowadays for the machine learning and deep learning, what essentially people do is they compute descriptors at multiple scales, and you can just feed them all together as a single, collate them and feed them into as a single feature vector, right? The next one is, as I mentioned, we looked at geometric classification, saying that they belong to an edge versus a surface versus a junction point and all of that. So we did geometric classification with that. The next thing we did was we tried to do geometric reconstruction. So given these are the points, can we reconstruct a rooftop from that and things like that, right? So that is the third application we did. We also tried to compute how much uncertainty is there for each point. That is essentially where we found the entropy. And then we used that to see if how much it would influence the classification of the point, the semantic classification of a point when you would use random forest classifiers or SVMs or something like that. What role does the uncertainty have in correctly classifying that particular point is something that we had looked at. And the last part is we looked at how we can collect these local descriptors together and find a descriptor for the entire point cloud. So the idea is how would we find a point cloud that is collected from an urban region versus forest? How would we find the difference between the two? So we need global descriptors. So these local descriptors can be aggregated together to find a global descriptor. That was the last thing. So the next thing we'll look at is a few applications where these eigenvalues are used from the local geometric descriptors, right? So we look at 5 different applications. The first one is probabilistic geometric classification. Second one is for visualization. We can create glyphs to look at each of these points, right? So like we put a point to draw the point cloud. Instead of a point, we can also put a glyph. Like how we use arrows for vectors, that's called a glyph. If we use that, we'll understand the data in a little bit better fashion, right? So that's the use of glyphs in visualization. The next one is we can use that to find optimal scale for extracting the features, right? So as I mentioned, we can extract features from multiple scales. Now, of which is the best scale that we can choose is something that we can use the eigenvalues for. The one after that is how would you do feature extraction for the semantic classification using the eigenvalues. So just to say here, the feature vector that is typically used for semantic classification in point clouds typically have other features as well, which are not eigenvalue based. They have features based on height, intensity, the waveform, so on and so forth. So those are again another set of features that could be used. Here I will just focus on the eigenvalue based features that are used. Then the last one is using difference of normals for segmentation, right? So this the normal that is for the surface, the local surface that we are estimating can be used for segmentation. And this normal estimation can be done using the eigenvalue analysis. So for probabilistic geometric classification, what we are saying is, now that we have a point and we say that it could belong to an edge type feature or a surface type feature or a junction type feature, what we really don't know is which one it belongs to. And unfortunately, for this kind of classification, there is no ground truth. You can, and it's hard to do manual annotation for these kind of things as well. Say, for example, the reason why I say manual annotation is difficult is also because if a point is very close to an edge, uh, how much of it would you say is an edge point, or how much of it would you say is a surface point, right? And we should also understand the how the points are generated, right? So the laser beams intersect with certain objects, and then you get these samples, right? Now these samples, it is not going to be that all the samples will lie on the edge for us to extract the edge very well, right? There will be points which are very close to the edge, and the idea is we have to use these points which are very close to the edge to see that there is an edge there, right? So that's the idea here. So then we come down to the thing that each of these points will not perfectly belong to a particular geometric class. They will have some combination. They will belong to, some part of it will look like an edge type point, some part of it will look like a surface type point, and some part of it will look like a junction type. But the goal for us is, whichever method we use, we should try to identify a method which will always make it belong to one of the three classes predominantly, so that we can actually classify them properly, right? If it is belonging to all the three classes more or less the same way, then it becomes a hard problem to solve, right? Which also ties down to the fact that we compute entropy using these measures, and when it is not tied to a particular class, the entropy will be very high. And entropy is essentially chaos, right? So if there is a lot of chaos, there's a lot of uncertainty as well, right? So this is essentially where the all of it is going. So here what we are saying is, we have this likelihood of a point belonging to each of the three geometric classes, right? So here we are discussing only 3D. So if it is two-dimensional point cloud, we will have only two classes. If it's four-dimensional, you will have four classes, right? So that's how this will work, right? Now, the way we compute the saliency map is essentially like this, right? So the likelihood of a particular point belonging to a line type feature is computed as the difference between the first two eigenvalues, and the likelihood of it belonging to surface type is given by the difference between the last two eigenvalues, and the third one is based on the last eigenvalue, the smallest eigenvalue. Here, I would also like to comment that these measures are more or less like this. The denominator that you can use for normalizing this can be anything. It can be the major eigenvalue, or it can be the sum of eigenvalues. So different papers have used different measures for the denominator for the normalization. That's also fine, right? Now, the thing that we are going to do now is, we will say that these are the likelihoods for a single scale. Now, if we say that each scale is going to be mutually exclusive of the other, then we can average the probabilities, like you would do in probability and statistics, right? So the same thing, you can just average them and use that as a multi-scale feature, right? Now, this is some of the results we got in our work. So this is essentially, so here we look at, we use the RGB channel, the red, green, blue channel for the point, the edge, the line type, the surface type, and the point type features. And this is what the covariance tensor, which is conventionally used, is given. This is what tensor voting, we did something called anisotropic diffusion after tensor voting, that gives us this. And if we correct that tensor voting result, because we get lesser junction type points here, but more prominent edge type points here, we get this result. And we can also see that this junction type points actually identify the foliage very nicely in this regard, right? So the geometric features are useful. Now we move on to saying, if we were to look at this, what kind of shape of the tensor itself that you can get. So as I mentioned, now you have a tensor for a point. The tensor itself has a shape, right? Now that shape is based on its place in something called the barycentric coordinate system. Just like you have the Cartesian coordinate system, another representation is the barycentric coordinate system, which is essentially represented using a triangle, and it is used for variables where you have coordinates where you have two independent and one dependent variable. Now we can use this saliency map that we have already computed here, that's CL and CS and CP. The good thing here is, because these are probabilities, they all add up to one. So we can say that two of them are independent and one is dependent, right? So then we can put them in this barycentric coordinate system, which is, so again, these come from the tensor field analysis in visualization, right? So that's something that that is used there. It's not something that was developed as a part of LiDAR point cloud processing per se. It was developed as a part of visualizing tensor fields, second order tensor fields. So that's where this comes from. So what this says is, you can actually now figure out a specific shape for the tensor if you were to find its place in this barycentric coordinate space. Now, the shapes will give us nice characteristics. So if we are putting these points, so this is just a toy example of a cube with this rooftop. Now, what we see here is these points have shapes based on the tensors that were computed there. Now, these are so these give like these line type features. So they actually represent them very well. And these are flat surfaces. So we get that. So this is to show that when we did the covariance tensor, it looked like this. When we did tensor voting, it looked like this. But when we did anisotropic diffusion in the tensor voting, we got something which looked the same like the covariance tensor, indicating that we can actually use this also as a local geometric descriptor. Now, this is essentially the design space for glyphs in tensor fields. So typically, ellipsoids are used because you can think of the three eigenvalues as being in three different dimensions. And the eigenvectors are perpendicular to each other. So you can look at them as the Cartesian coordinate system. And the eigenvalues will tell you what the size in each direction is, and that gives you an ellipsoid. Now, when you look at the ellipsoid, depending on what the CP values are, you can find an appropriate ellipsoid for that. Now, the only problem with this thing is that the ellipsoids have issues when you rotate a particular scene. The ellipsoids, different ellipsoids can have the same shape, right? From the way it is being rotated and from the way you look at it. So there was some work done in 2004 to come up with new tensor glyphs, which will disambiguate what kind of tensor you have. The only thing that they had done then was, depending on what the saliency value is, you can figure out a lot more control parameters and see how that will help in looking at uh, generating the glyphs themselves, right? So that's essentially how these glyphs are generated. So if you look at this, alpha and beta are used using the CL and CP values, that is the likelihood of a point belonging to a line type feature or the point belonging to the point type feature. And there's this control parameter gamma, and based on the change in gamma, we can see different kinds of glyphs coming up, right? In the alpha beta space, this is the space that is occupied by positive semi-definite um, tensors, right? So this is essentially what they had come up with. It's called superquadric because there is a quadric function that gets used, and that will determine the shape of the glyph. Now, we tried using the same for point clouds. The only issue we faced was it gets too crowded, and it takes a long time to generate these images. So we were able to do it for few regions in the point cloud as well, because this is a superlinear algorithm really. So But the thing is, we could see some characteristics of the local geometric descriptors we use. So in that regard, this was useful. So we could see that the covariance tensor didn't give very sharp edges. But if you look at the tensor voting, they gave very sharp edges. This one is the tensor voting. This is a tensor voting with anisotropic diffusion. This is the covariance tensor with anisotropic diffusion, and we can actually see that we get very good results with covariance tensor already. And if we improve on it, we can actually use the tensor voting and get better results for extracting geometry, right? Now the next application was optimal scale selection. In this, what the original paper that had proposed using eigenvalues for that said was, you can again find the same characteristics like the saliency values that we have. Here the it's again computed the same way. The only difference is there is those factors are missing, but that really doesn't matter as much. Then the idea here is we find the entropy based on these values, which the Shannon entropy, and we find the scale at which the Shannon entropy is the lowest. So when we say Shannon entropy is the lowest, it just means that the uncertainty is the lowest and that the point has figured out which class it belongs to, right? So once it figures out which class it is belonging to with a particular scale, that is the best scale really. So that defines what scale it is going to be. So this is my visualization of, say, when it is you're looking at only the line type, the saliency map. So that is the CL map, the A1D as they call it, which is the linear map. This is the A2D, which is the planar map, and this is A3D, which is the volumetric or scatter map. Right. So they look at this to identify which ones to use the best for each point. So what this is really saying is, some of these, so these green lines, they have been able to disambiguate if it is a one-dimensional or two-dimensional feature, but they are very good as three-dimensional features. So something like that, right? So then it's best to use a scale which identifies it as a three-dimensional feature, right? So this is the entropy value. So it is minus a this value here into its logarithmic value, and the sum of all of that and the for all those features, that gives the entropy value. And whichever scale is going to minimize this entropy value is a scale that is going to give you which geometric class that particular point is going to belong to, and that will give us the better best result. So we can choose that scale for that point. Right, so we computed local geometric descriptors for different scales, but now we will say we will use only the local geometric descriptor at the optimal scale where the entropy is going to be low. Now, these are the eigenvalue features which have been used for semantic classification quite frequently. So this also you see repetition, right? So there is linear type feature, the planar type feature, the sphericity feature. Then there are several other features like this is omnivariance. Omnivariance is again a it's invariant. It's a tensor invariant if you look at it from the point of view of second order tensors. Similarly, the trace of the sum of the eigenvalues is the trace of the matrix. So that is also an invariant, right? So you see the tensor properties also being incorporated here, right? So that's the other thing. Then the last application that I want to talk about is the difference of normals. So there was a paper which was published in 2012, which started discussing about using difference of normal as a multi-scale operator. So what it says is you can find the local geometric descriptor or whatever information in two different scales, and then use the information in a good fashion, right? And the kind of information that you want to figure out. Now, the information that they have talked about figuring out is that you find the normal at that particular point, right, for that particular scale, and then you check that same thing, that normal again for a different scale, and the difference that you would get between the normals will tell you how much the structure has changed. So what that means is if your surface is changed because of addition of new points, it's going to say that its normal itself has changed, right? And so you want to find the difference of the normals. One of the things that I should have probably said in the beginning of the talk itself is that when you look at these points that you get from LiDAR point clouds, it's essentially, it's like a sheet that has been captured, right? So the light beams have all fallen in different places, captured different points. Now you can stitch all of these points together and form a surface. It's like somebody's put a tent on the region that you want to cover, and the shape of the tent is essentially what we are trying to study, right? So that's essentially what all of these methodologies are talking about, is that there is a surface that is pertaining to each of these points, and that surface will have a normal to it. Now, this normal can be estimated using the eigenvectors of the local geometric descriptor, and the difference of such normals will help you to find some salient characteristic of that point, right? So this is the difference between the normals. So it's a vector difference. So there are other things that one must worry about, that the normals are in the same direction and all of that. So there are some corrections we can do for all of those things. So this difference of normal will also help in segmentation. Point cloud library is a widely used library for point cloud processing. It's available in Python, it's available in C, C++. That particular one, they have incorporated the difference of normal for segmentation. Now, segmentation just says that we want to get to the instance level. Like, for example, this is a building, these are the windows of the building, this is the road. So you want the point cloud to be segmented based on different objects in that particular scene, and difference of normals based on what you use as the two scales for the difference, you can get very good results for segmentation. So that's essentially what it has been very widely used for. I'm sorry, I have a power cut at home. Okay, so I'm almost at the end of my talk. So the next one I wanted to kind of show is their results with respect to the Kitty data set, which is the vehicle LiDAR data set. And what they had said was the segmentation that they get from the difference of normals when they use different scales is gives very high accuracy. So this is the precision and recall chart that they looked at, and they found most of the points giving very high precision and recall when they look at how the segmentation has happened. So this is essentially the next thing that they looked at for the Kitty dataset. So they found the difference of normals to be a very good method. Now the difference of normal goes back to how you estimate that local surface normal, right? And the local surface normal can be done estimated using different ways. One is to look at the local surface that is fitted there and then see what the normal for that local surface is going to be. That's the computational geometry way. But the other way is, now we have done this hard job of finding the local geometric descriptors and so on and so forth. We can then also take the minor eigenvector, that is the eigenvector that corresponds to the smallest eigenvalue, and use that as the estimation of the local normal, right? So that is another way of doing it. There has been enough work where this has been used. This was first used in Hoppe's paper that was in 1992. This is a classical paper in computer graphics, which actually talked about the covariance tensor to start with. If you look at the LiDAR point cloud processing papers, you wouldn't find this connection at all, but a lot of this actually came from computer graphics. And in that paper, the idea was to reconstruct surface using point clouds, and covariance tensor was used as a local geometric descriptor, and the minor eigenvector was used for finding the local normal, and the rest just followed. right? So that was the start of even using covariance matrix and things like that. And I found several works after this. I just mentioned this one because it was used for reconstruction using the LiDAR point clouds. So this is my summary. So what we have talked about in this whole talk is we talked about the LiDAR technology, how it captures point clouds, and how we want to do local geometric analysis of the point cloud so that we can process the point cloud and get information about what each point means in that point cloud. And this information is encoded in the form of local geometric descriptors. We have then done eigenvalue decomposition of the local geometric descriptors after saying they are represented using second order tensor fields. And then we looked at what these eigenvalues have been used for. So that's all for now. I'll be happy to take questions. I see a lot of questions here. I can answer them one by one.
Hello, madam.
Yeah, hello.
Madam, can we have the questions? I will start from the participants. I will call the name so they can kindly unmute and ask the questions. So the first question is from Dimple Shahjahan, madam. Madam, please unmute yourself and ask the questions.
Hi, good morning, madam.
Yeah, hi, Dimple.
Put on your video also, madam.
Sorry, I don't have a camera working now.
Okay, fine.
Madam, it was a very interesting talk. I think you have worked in this building roof point clouds, airborne building point lidar point clouds, right? Of building roofs. So, what techniques have you used for this processing of this roof point clouds? And like if you have used this tensor based like local computing local geometric descriptors, are there any factors which cannot be addressed by using this tensor based computing only, and we have to look for some other techniques like deep learning based machine learning based techniques? So that was my question. Any limitations for this tensor based computing?
Sure. So for the tensor-based computing, we had used only for gable roofs because we got, like I mentioned, when we use the tensor voting, we got better edge type features. When we looked at cable roof, that is those sloping roofs, and you get that line there, that we could extract very well. But that's a tensor based method wasn't sufficient for that, to be frank. So we used the tensor based method to identify these lines, which are called the tensor lines.
Other participants, can you please unmute yourself? There is a disturbance being created.
Okay. Thank you. So you can compute these tensor lines which connect, and then the idea is if the data is clean and if everything works, the tensor line should actually reveal the edge itself. But that doesn't work that way. So what we had to then do is we had to find these long tensor lines and then club them together and then extract using um, these kind of line fitting algorithms that is used in computational geometry. That said, there is a lot of methods which are using machine learning and deep learning for extraction of lines. If you look at Tino Hackels papers, they do a lot of work in that sense where they are extracting lines. They are actually extracting points which fall, which are boundary points, and then you can do line fitting and all of that.
Madam, one more question. Like it is regarding the reconstruction of this LiDAR point clouds. So how do we ensure the correct reconstruction of this 3D LiDAR point clouds? Since the point clouds we captured are full of noise and outliers will be present there, right? Even if we do a lot of pre-processing. So how
Right.
do we ensure? correct
Right.
reconstruction.
So typically, yeah, so you will get some result, right? So assume you have, done outlier removal and then you have figured out these lines eventually, right? So part of your question is as to how to validate it, right? So the way we had done for our JSTARS paper is we had actually asked the Wahingen data providers because we worked in the Wahingen data set, and they gave us the geotiffs which had because they had a benchmark challenge on identifying rooftops. So they gave us the geotiff which had these roofs marked, and for the ones that we were able to extract, we compared the top view of whatever we had. So we did it in I mean, again, I really don't know if there's a better way of doing it, but because they are geotiffed and they are geo-referenced, you should be able to validate if you got the correct roof. And you can look at how much of it got overlapped, as in the surfaces that you computed as a part of the roof versus the ground truth, and then see. So that is one way of validating. The other way of, we did try a few methods. The other thing was we superimposed on OpenStreetMap and we superimposed on Google Maps and all of that. So we identified the region which we were looking at, and then there were building layouts, so we were able to superimpose and check how correct we were. We weren't absolutely correct as it goes, but some of these things it depends on what kind of accuracy you're looking for. So most of the things that I have seen these reconstruction for is to build city models and do 3D printing of all of these kind of things. So even if it is not accurate to to that extent, but you have really identified the correct shape of and roughly the correct size of the rooftops, that is sufficient usually. So it should be fine.
Thank you, ma'am. Next is Lakshmi Prasanna. Sri Lakshmi Prasanna, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Good morning, madam. Hello.
Yeah, hello, I can hear you.
Ma'am, good morning, ma'am. Ma'am, I have a doubt is what is the difference between EVD and SVD? Told in eigenvalue decomposition and singular value decomposition. What is the main difference and where we can use what is in respect of the application?
Right. So when you do, so the singular value decomposition is typically done for non-square matrices. So you can do it for square matrices as well, and you can do it for non-square matrices. But the EVD is somewhat restricted only for square matrices. Now for SVD, the thing is it's equivalent to EVD, but the singular values you get are essentially square of the eigenvalues. So that is a slight difference. Again, there are different, if you look at numerical analysis techniques or scientific computing techniques to do this, there are several methods to do EVD and SVD. And the idea mostly comes from how many eigenvalues do you want to compute up to, or how many singular values you want to compute up to. But the relationship between the singular values and eigenvalues, if the matrix itself is square, is that the singular values will be square of the eigenvalues.
Thank you.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Thank
So,
you.
okay, just to backtrack, there are two things. So when you do singular value decomposition, you again get two matrices like the eigenvectors, right? The eigenvector matrix that I talked about for eigenvalue decomposition, you would get a left and a right singular value vector for that. Now, when it comes to a square matrix, these two matrices, so you would get U lambda, U sigma V for singular value decomposition. The U and
Yes.
the V are orthonormal matrices.
Yes.
Now, they will be very different for singular values, but when you look at eigenvalues, that U and V become the same. So that's why you get
Yes.
one to be a transpose of the other.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Next question is from Sri Ashish Paul. Kindly ask the question.
Yes. Good morning, madam. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
It was very nice presentation and very much informative. My question is that is it possible to collect the terrestrial data like using your LiDAR in hilly area like Arunachal Pradesh?
I don't know as much about the collection part. Actually, I see Professor Bharat Lohani is here. He might be more qualified to answer these questions. So I would, ask his help for that. I'm fairly certain it should be possible, but then there are some legal rules associated with collection of data, is what I understand. So
Yeah, well, Ashish, we'll have that question just afternoon, or Professor Bharat Lahani is there.
yeah, so
Okay,
please
thank
do.
you, madam. Thank you. Thank you. So
The next is, right?
Okay, the next question is
Okay,
from
okay.
Sri
Okay.
Santi.
Okay, thank you so much.
Oh, you have another question. Okay, the next question is
Yes,
from
ma'am. Are you able to hear? Hello, ma'am?
Yeah, I can see
Yeah,
you.
yeah, ma'am.
Yeah, you don't
Uh,
have a video on, but that's
Can
fine.
you
Yeah.
please on your video, Sandeep?
yes, ma'am. Yeah, yeah. My video is also on.
Sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks. Yeah, let's see. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, the question is, can we use LiDAR facility for to mapping this third hazard, especially the moving object like some truck or some like
Yeah,
local
yeah.
regional movements? Yeah.
So the
How we can
vehicle
do that?
lidar is used for that. Yeah.
Yeah, ma'am. How we can do? What kind of approach we have to need to adopt?
So there are Velodyne sensors which are typically used for autonomous driving, which I mean you can mount on a car and that car will capture the information around. So it depends on what kind of use you want. So for example, for surveillances, typically airborne lidar can be used, but the problem is you need infrastructure or the mechanism for collecting the data. The other one is you can capture moving vehicles just by vehicle lidar by just mounting the sensor on a moving car and just capture the traffic data as is. So there is a data set that was released by IIIT Hyderabad and Intel, which is called the Indian Driving Data Set, which has lidar point clouds for moving vehicles on the roads. I understand that that data is available for us to use. From what I know, the little I know, the calibration data is not there. So maybe, yeah, it'll be hard to use it in a complete fashion, but you should be able to use that. So that is another way of capturing the moving vehicle data. So one is using vehicle lidar. You can also using the airborne lidar as well. So it depends on what application you're looking for.
Yeah. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
The next question is from Sri Jyoti Rupa. Jyoti Rupa, please unmute yourself. Jyoti Rupa, are you there? Okay, sir. So, madam, we will move on to the next participant, Dr. Giridhar. Dr. Giridhar, sir, please unmute yourself. Dr. Giridhar, sir.
Yes, madam. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, madam. Actually, we are working with the Greater Hyderabad Municipal Corporation for the tax assessment using optical remote sensing. Can we use LiDAR for tax assessment in the municipal area? Because in the regular remote sensing, we are facing difficulty discrimination of the buildings and to find out how many floors are there. That is a difficulty. Can we use LiDAR for tax? Any application, madam? Anywhere work applied in the country?
I don't think it is applied, but you can use. So it depends on which LiDAR technology you're using. If it's airborne LiDAR, unless you see a change in the shape with the number of floors, which is typically doesn't happen, right? When you have a floor, the plan for a building, it will look the same from the top view, right?
Yes,
Irrespective of the
true.
number of floors. So then airborne LiDAR will not be very useful, but you can definitely use terrestrial LiDAR to, capture that information. And even like vehicle LiDAR it doesn't have that much range to capture say, certain heights. So you may not get for the entire building. So terrestrial LiDAR would be the best option actually.
Can you have any idea, madam, how much cost it differs from LiDAR to regular remote sensing?
Unfortunately, I don't
Because
know.
regular remote sensing is a cheap.
Dr. Giridhar, maybe I can answer the questions a little later. We have been
Okay.
some kind of things in that regard. Maybe we can have more elongated discussions.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, sir. Amarosa. Thank you so much.
I'm so sorry about that.
Thank you, ma'am. Next is a question from Sri Minhaji. Minhaji, please unmute yourself and ask. Minhaji.
Not here, then.
Okay, sir. So next question is from Dr. Venkateshwara. Sir, please unmute yourself. Yeah. Sorry. We will move on to Venkata Krishnan. Sri Venkata Krishnan, can you please unmute and ask?
Yes, ma'am. Good morning, ma'am. Nice presentation, ma'am.
Thank you.
We are so happy to get the information from your side. And what is the difference between contra and covariant vectors?
So there are contravariant and covariant tensors are created in a different fashion. So when I said that you can use say what is that thing called, two tensors to create another tensor, a higher order tensor. Depending on what kind of tensor you would use, it will yield different kinds of tensors. So, for example, covariant and contravariant, I think it has to do with something to do with the coordinate system that is used for computing those tensors. So when I say there is a second order tensor, so when I said that it is a tangent tensor versus a normal tensor, it actually disassociates itself with respect to its contravariant and covariant components. Now, the covariant components can be 0 and contravariant components can have, 2. Then it's still a second order tensor. Something with one contravariant and one covariant component is also a second order tensor. And, so there are combinations of 0, 2, 1, 1, and 2, 0. So depending on what are the contravariant and the covariant components, the tensors will be different. So second order tensor itself has 3 different types of tensors based on the kind of covariant and contravariant components it has. And the way to describe them is they're based on different coordinate systems in which they are computed. I'll just keep it, otherwise I'm going to give you a lecture on tensor analysis now. So
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
The next question is from Vasudha. Ma'am, please ask the question. Sri Vasudha.
Madam, excuse me, madam. Can I ask the question?
Yeah. Please go ahead.
Yeah, good morning, madam. I'm Jyoti Rupa. Can I know that can LiDAR be used successfully for soil erosion?
I have seen some work being done. I personally haven't done that. So there has been some use cases of LiDAR where it's used for coastline recession and soil erosion. Of course, if there is a variation in height, you can capture it over time and figure out that there has been soil erosion. So it becomes a time bound event. So you'll have to need to have that many LiDAR scans done across time to identify a particular region and the heights in that region, and you can find soil erosion. Definitely.
Okay. Thank you very much, madam. Thank you.
Shall I ask my question, madam? I am
Sure.
Dr. K. Venkateshwara Rao.
Sure. Yeah. Please do.
Madam, assume that we have the LiDAR data for a forest area, and we want to cluster the different types of trees. And
Okay.
assume that we have the point cloud, maybe collected through drones.
Right.
Now you describe this tensor vector covariance matrix. From this, can you apply some DB scan algorithm to cluster and find out how many trees are there of different types
Yeah.
in each cluster?
It depends on the foliage, right? If it's dense foliage, it will be hard to cluster. If it is so it depends on the kind of forest also. So I would think coniferous forests, you can use that kind of clustering mechanism to finding trees. But I don't know about the other types of forests. So depending on how the foliage layout is also, it has to give the thing. But I have seen work where LiDAR point clouds are used for classifying the kind of trees the points are from. So that is also done apart from segmentation that you're talking about to find different tree instances. I have seen the other work also done. For the finding the tree instances, obviously it has to depend on how the foliage is for that particular forest. So for example, I would think in rainforests, it will be very hard to figure out, instances of trees. Even with clustering, it will be hard.
Otherwise, we can identify the tree class. We can classify the tree correctly using this
See,
point cloud.
so in an orchard, for instance, if you have, planted the trees in a certain ordered fashion, and there is space between the trees, you can do clustering, DB scan or any other regular clustering, which will allow you to find. Actually, you can even use k-means clustering if you know the number of trees, for instance, right? So it depends on what methodology you can use. DB scan is useful because you can use
Non-spherical clustering can be.
yeah. So if you don't know the number of trees, obviously you'll have to use a method which is not which doesn't take into consideration the k value. You can even use hierarchical clustering or something to find the clusters there. But you need to know a priori about the data set, right? So depending on what forest area, what kind of foliage is expected there, you will be able to then use. So it's not usable for all forest types.
Oh, thank you, madam.
Okay, thank you, madam. That was a wonderful session about LiDAR point cloud. Thank you on elaborating about the LiDAR point cloud from the perspective of computation geometry and computer graphics, and starting from the very basic of points in the point cloud, going through their neighbors and the local and global descriptors, then the applications that is involved in that. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. And thank you all the participants for their questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a good day. Bye.
Many thanks, Professor
thanks.
Jaya Nair. And it's really heartening that we started with the first part of this LiDAR process with a high note, and
I'm happy.
we are grateful for your interactive session.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you for having me here. Yeah.
Right.
Bye.
Thank you, ma'am.
So, dear participants, we have our next session at 11:55 precisely. It's Professor Bharat Lohani. It's actually a very high-level kind of gentleman and opportunity for us. So I request you to be sharp in joining back. So we break for now, and 11:55 would be everybody kindly be in. Okay, right. Thank you. We'll be soon, very soon. Thank you.